In the 21st century, our leaders have warned us that the greatest threat to humanity in our time will be marked by violent differences between cultures. 100 years ago, a poet-philosopher from British India, Allama Iqbal, spoke of a more hopeful vision for the future.
And Iqbal was the last great flowering of this rich tradition of wisdom poetry in Urdu and in Persian in the Indian environment.
Educated in the finest institutions of Europe, yet subjected to colonial rule in India, Iqbal was an inspiration to the people of the subcontinent. Living between worlds, he believed mutual respect for the cultural other was the only way for unity to be achieved.
To have somebody like this on our screen as a possibility 100 years ago is extremely important because it refutes the facile notion of a clash of civilization. It demonstrates both to Americans and Europeans on the one hand and to people in Asian Muslim countries on the other hand that this is not only a possibility, but it's been a part of our world for well over 100 years.
Differences perceived as threatening by some were celebrated in Iqbal's poetry. He believed diversity was the underlying force that sustained our ever-changing world. As an Islamic reformer, Iqbal encouraged Muslims to see the wisdom of the Quran as synonymous with advancements in modern science.
So the first really important contribution of Iqbal is to speak to folks broadly in the 21st century in the West and to say to them, come back again, re-look at science, which you believe is central to modern life, re-look at scripture, particularly the Quran, which you may look at as something outside of the modern world, and I'll show you how these two have always been an intimate relationship.
Iqbal understood that it was only through our relationships with others that we could begin to see ourselves. He would call the rampant military paranoia of our times a crisis of understanding. We are not making the world safer through imperial or corporate conquest in the name of freedom. In reality, we have waged a war against our own being. During the mid-1800s, the British East India Company began to monopolize trade and commerce in South Asia. By 1857, desperate Indian soldiers sparked an uprising against the occupation. This event was perceived as the first battle for India's independence. Yet the revolt failed, and in 1858, the dissolution of the East India Company transferred control of India to British Parliament. It was amidst this oppressive atmosphere that Iqbal's family descended to the Punjab from the mountains of Kashmir. Originally Hindu Brahmins, they converted to Islam and settled in a town called Sialkot. In 1877, Muhammad Iqbal was born. At the age of 18, Iqbal left for Lahore. It was a vibrant city, full of admiration for the arts. Preoccupied with poetry, he flunked his law examinations. In the midst of an unhappy arranged marriage, Iqbal came into contact with another teacher who would change his life. Thomas Arnold was a British scholar with a deep respect for Islam. The two men forged a great friendship, and when Arnold left India to return to England, he encouraged Iqbal to pursue a higher education abroad.
But what Arnold did is to basically say, you know, you're one of the brightest guys I've taught. Instead of simply being a lawyer, which of course he was trained to be, so, you know, think about this larger possibility that you could be a scholar.
When Iqbal was 28, he left Lahore for England in 1905. Living in England had showed Iqbal the reality of colonialism on a much broader scale. Although just as gifted as his peers, Iqbal felt treated as a second-class citizen, a sensation he was happy to be rid of in 1907, when he continued his education in Germany. It would be the only time in his life when he was not a subject to the British throne. When Iqbal returned to India in 1908, he was a changed man. Following his return from Europe, Iqbal began taking note of his experiences in a small book that wouldn't be published until after his death. From these stray reflections sprouted the seeds of most of his great works. Being totally immersed in the culture that dominated his homeland had allowed Iqbal to see himself clearly, and the experience had left him determined to help inspire the Muslims of India.
And he comes back to India and he begins to reconnect with his own people, and what takes his breath away is what he finds the state of denial, and he finds that his own fellow men and women, as if they have locked themselves out of that festivity, of that festival of change. And this is an amazing struggle to dawn upon his own people that there is this banquet of change happening. Be a part of it, or you'd be too late.
Upon his return, Iqbal began teaching at Government College. Unsatisfied and preferring not to work for the British government, he began to practice law, earning just enough to sustain his family. Europe had left Iqbal in between worlds. He believed the people of India could benefit from the modern education, but it needed to be applied in a way that was compatible with the real essence of their tradition.
The East, and particularly the Muslim East, has opened its eyes after slumbering for centuries. The Eastern people have, however, realized that life cannot affect a revolution in its environment before it has had, in the first instance, a revolution in the inner depths of its own being. Nor can a new world assume external form before its existence takes on a shape in the hearts of men.
Iqbal was encouraging the people of South Asia to carry their traditions forward and align them with the future. In 1911, just as European powers began to occupy the majority of the Muslim world, Iqbal's writing became less romantic and more political. His words spoke directly to the community, encouraging the active transformation of individuals.
He's stimulating them by his poetry to say, wake up. You know, the world is beautiful, God is good. There's no reason for you to be depressed and miserable like that.
Iqbal considered Rumi his spiritual guide. He would regularly turn to the mystical poetry of Rumi for inspiration. During his time in Germany, Iqbal had achieved his PhD in Persian metaphysics. Much of the vast history of Eastern mysticism followed the belief that all of nature was a part of God. Iqbal believed this created a dangerous rift between personal responsibility and vague spiritual principles.
The world is not something to be seen or known through concepts, but something to be made and remade through continuous action.
Because he was looking for what was the problem that had allowed European powers to overwhelm the Muslim states of Asia. And like many people, he began to look for some kind of ideological error or some metaphysical mistake that had taken people astray. And so Sufism became a candidate for the villain.
The early 1900s saw the vast majority of the Muslim world in disrepair. Colonialism had successfully covered half the globe. By 1922, the British alone held control over 25% of the world's population. As a result, many of the people living under this domination were terrified that their own cultures were being destroyed.
He certainly is feeling that there's a lament that Muslims could have for their loss of, if you will, worldly or political power in the grand scheme of things, because they've been reduced to being a colony, a subset of a place called the Empire, which is Britain.
Struggling to find peace in turbulent times, Iqbal remarried twice after his return from Europe. His first marriage had come to an end, and though he supported his wife financially until his death, his eldest son, Aftab, would never forgive his father. In November of 1914, both Iqbal's mother and his daughter, Miraj, passed away. Amidst tragedy at home and the mounting tensions of World War I, Iqbal began writing a book in Persian titled The Secrets of the Self. Influenced greatly by Rumi, it was a call to action and an illustration of the power we have as individuals.
He was very aware of the novelty of his thought, the irreverence of his questioning, and the task ahead of him. But he was going on and on about the question of how do you awaken the mind?
The form of existence is an effect of the self. Everything you see is a secret of the self. When the self awoke to consciousness, it revealed a universe of thought. 100 words are hidden in its essence. Self-affirmation brings not self to light. By the self, the seed of opposition is sown in the world. It imagines itself to be other than itself, and it makes from itself the forms of others.
Life, to Iqbal, could only be described in terms of experience, and experience is a function of the ego or the self. The personality of a self must be defined in terms of its own action. So the movements of the universe, from atoms to galaxies, are various expressions of this same organization. Iqbal believed consciousness was not just a property of humankind, but a vital process of cosmic development.
I think the distinction of spirit and body has done a lot of harm. Man is essentially a force, or rather a combination of forces.
Just as self-realization must be actualized by individuals, so too must communities discover their own identity.
The self has layers, and we only sort of, as it were, scratch the surface or get each inch down in our lifetime, and we don't know the depths of the possibilities of our own being.
The situation in the subcontinent was changing rapidly, and by the time the First World War had ended in 1918, well over 1 million Indians had served the British with the hopes of achieving self-government. When this did not happen, the vast disappointment ushered in a new era of unrest in the communities of India. By this time, Iqbal had become a well-respected poet, not just in the Punjab, but throughout South Asia and parts of Europe. In Lahore, people would visit Iqbal's home regularly. Everyone from students to politicians sought advice, and all were welcome. He would rarely leave his house. His days were divided between reading, writing, and discussions that could run late into the night, covering topics ranging from the nature of existence to the communal problems of India. Becoming ever more respected as a man of the people, his work continued to express his main convictions about the changing political landscape. Iqbal continually tried to appeal to the West through his writing, but his message was not being received. The people of India, however, were listening.
The inner turmoil of the nations is precursor to some great spiritual and cultural change. The Great War of Europe was an apocalypse. It has annihilated the old world order in nearly every dimension. Nature is now creating a new Adam and a new world to suit him in the depths of life, from the ashes of culture and civilization, and we can see a vague glimpse of this in the writings of Einstein.
Before the term quantum mechanics had been coined, Iqbal understood Einstein's theory of relativity as an opportunity for religion and science to find common ground. This new world Einstein was describing mirrored the one Iqbal had been waiting for. It was an opportunity to take a deeper look at what had gone unquestioned for centuries. In his writing, he says,
Classical physics has learned to criticize its own foundations. As a result of this criticism, the kind of materialism which it originally necessitated is rapidly disappearing.
Iqbal shared Einstein's assertion that the highest achievements of science came from a cosmic religious feeling of the universe. This humble appreciation of the mystery of one's own being was a feeling Iqbal believed the modern world had begun to lose. The only way to preserve this mystery in one's own life was through love, more than a mere emotion, but as a mystical force, as Rumi had also described. Love, as an active awareness, gives vision to our world and infuses human action with a higher purpose.
Beyond the stars, there are other worlds. Beyond the heavens, there are still more worlds. The test of love goes beyond all of these worlds. You only exist insofar as you love. If you do not love, you do not exist.
On December 29, 1930, Iqbal made his famous Allahabad address, in which he became the first to mention the idea of Pakistan as an autonomous region in the subcontinent. On April 21, 1938, Muhammad Iqbal died in Lahore. Over 20,000 mourners flooded the streets of the city. Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs all paid their respects to the man who had become known throughout the subcontinent as one of the most important thinkers and political activists of his time. Written in Persian on his tomb were words appealing to the same universal message he had upheld for his entire life.
We belong to the garden and descend from the same ancestors. Distinctions of color and race are forbidden to us. We are the harvests of a new spring.
He was buried next to Badshahi Mosque in Lahore, where as a young man he had once read his poems to large gatherings. Dirt from his grave was brought to Konya, Turkey, and an honorary tomb was respectfully placed outside of Rumi's own grave.